Welcome to the Daniel K. Inouye National Center for the Preservation of Democracy. Located on the campus of the Japanese American National Museum in the historic Little Tokyo district of downtown Los Angeles, the center sits next to the former Nishi Honganji Buddhist Temple. Built in 1925, it was the first Buddhist temple constructed in Los Angeles. Today, it is known as Janim's Historic Building. This site has become a hallowed ground in the fight for civil rights. In 1942, Japanese Americans in the Los Angeles area were gathered here to be taken to concentration camps. The Democracy Center was built as part of a renovation and expansion of the historic building in 2005. The project added nearly 10,000 square feet with a facade and interior that dramatically contrasts new and old, east and west. This includes the Democracy Lab, a multi-purpose space that is used for exhibitions, performances, classroom-style learning, and community convenings. And the Tateuchi Democracy Forum, a dramatic 198-seat theater and lecture hall. The Democracy Center is more than just a building. It is a place for the community to convene with artists, historians, culture workers, and thought leaders to discuss today's most pressing issues facing democracy. Through national and local public programs, including civic dialogues and public forums, lecture series, arts fellowships and residencies, performance, art and multimedia exhibits, and youth education programs, the Democracy Center gathers people of all ages and diverse backgrounds to examine issues around race, identity, and social justice to transform attitudes, celebrate culture, and promote civic engagement. Utilizing Janim's historical collection of artifacts, stories, and cultural perspective, the Democracy Center explores the rights, freedoms, and enduring fragility of democracy. In the words of Senator Inouye, the Democracy Center is a testament to the twin truths. The U.S. is a multicultural nation that thrives on its diversity, and that those excluded from the full protections of the Constitution have, in their claims to those rights, extended the Constitution's promise and thereby preserved the freedoms of all Americans. The Democracy Center envisions an enduring American democracy where all people understand and embrace their right and responsibility to take part.
Good evening, everybody. I'm David Ono. For those just joining us now, many of you know me from ABC 7 Eyewitness News here in Los Angeles. I'm also Janim's on their board of governors and proud to be here in honor of the late Irene Hirano Inouye, the inaugural executive director and former president of the Japanese American National Museum. It's going to be a beautiful evening tonight. We celebrate Irene with the inaugural Irene Hirano Inouye Distinguished Lecture here at the Daniel K. Inouye National Center for Preservation of Democracy, and of course, named for Irene's late husband and U.S. Senator, the Honorable Daniel Inouye. And didn't you love that quote of his in that video? So relevant today. So we're here today at the Democracy Center, and as it was beautifully profiled in the video, it is a place envisioned by its founders and Janim to be where people who would gather to deepen our commitment to democracy, examine protections and liberties guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution and facets of freedom for all who live in the United States. And this is why today's event is so special. We are in a moment in time where we are reminded of the significance of the resilience of our democracy and also the fight to keep it. It is we, the people, who make our democracy strong. When we bring people together, have difficult conversations, and build bridges, democracy prevails. So it's here at the Democracy Center where we can uplift voices and democracy for all collective pursuit of a brighter future for all. So earlier today, we gathered together for a reception celebrating Irene Hirano Inouye, and we heard from many of Irene's longtime friends and colleagues, each of them esteemed leaders in their own right, including Janim's board chair, William T. Fujioka, Kresge Foundation President CEO Rip Rapson, a foundation that Irene served for many years as board chair and trustee. Director of the Daniel K. Inouye Institute, Jennifer Sabas, President of Japan House, Yuko Kaifu, and JANM's Vice President of Exhibitions and Director, Clement Hanami. Thank you to all for sharing your reflections of Irene and her legacy of leadership and your special connection to her. It made us all miss her, but also appreciate her greatness. Now, I'd like to acknowledge special guests here today. We are honored to have Irene Hirano Inouye's family with us this evening, daughter Jennifer Hirano, sister Linda Hayashi, brother Stephen Yasutake, and other members of her family. Thank you for sharing Irene's life with us and continuing her legacy. So we also welcome distinguished guests. We have Councilmember Jeff Bologna of Alhambra. We have Councilor Kentaro Orita for the Embassy of Japan in the United States of America. Consul Aya Ishii of the Consulate General of Japan in Los Angeles. Members of the Irene Hirano Inouye Distinguished Lecture Series Advisory Council who are here with us today, and their names can be found listed in the program. JANM Board of Trustees and Governors, supporters of the Democracy Center and its programs, and appreciation to our guests who have traveled to be with us today, and of course our volunteers and staff of JANM, many of who served alongside Irene throughout her tenure here. So thank you for the generous support and to all of our Democracy Center supporters. Tonight, we honor Irene's life and legacy with the inaugural Irene Hirano Inouye Distinguished Lecture centered on the leadership values and principles that inspire Irene to empower community, to uplift women, and to build bridges between the U.S. and Japan. This signature series will feature national leaders and voices who are shaping democracy to provoke thought and inspire change in the United States. So now, it is my honor to introduce JANM's President, CEO, and a dear friend, Ann Burroughs.
Good evening, everyone. It's such an honor to be with all of you. It's always a joy for me to welcome anybody to JANM, but today it's such a privilege to have all of you here, all of you our honored guests, as we gather in this historic space to celebrate Irene and to pay tribute to her vision, her leadership, and her unwavering dedication that shaped JANM into the world-class institution it is today. For all of us at JANM, and in fact, all of us in the room, we are so keenly aware, and I certainly am, that we stand on Irene's shoulders. As its founding president and CEO, she quite literally transformed this institution from an idea, from a twinkle in the eye of our founders, into an institution that aspired to excellence, and she elevated it to a national and global stage. And tonight, as we launch this distinguished lecture series in Irene's honor, which we really see is a testament to her enduring influence and to her lifelong commitment to fostering dialogue, understanding, and to building community. When I first came to JANM, and it was almost 9 years ago, which always surprises me a little bit when I think about that, Irene was one of the first people who reached out her hand to me, as she did to so many others. And she really was a mentor in the truest sense, not just by guiding, but always by uplifting, always by stretching out that hand, not just with wisdom, but with an extraordinary generosity of spirit that made you feel, she gave you the aura, she gave you the space to grow. And she knew that she would also allow you to fail. She might have been a little bit strict, but there was always that encouragement. And certainly when I came to JANM, I was an outsider. I had no background in the museum world. And when I sat with Irene in my first meeting with her, I'd known her for several years. And I looked at her and I just threw up my hands and I started laughing. And she laughed with me, and she totally got it. And she said, "Don't worry, we'll have your back." And she always did. She always did. But, you know, I was so keenly aware in those early days, and I still am, of the enormous responsibility of following in Irene's footsteps. But now looking back over the almost 9 years, I realize it's not so much the footsteps that I remember. It's not so much the imprint of her footsteps, but it's that extraordinary spring in her step that she always had, that propelled everybody forward that was within her ambit, and that she propelled. It was that spring in the step that propelled the museum forward. So I'm also so keenly aware, as I've now become much more settled into my role after 9 years and into the museum world, of just how powerfully, how groundbreaking she was in setting that gold standard for what a community-based museum should be, for what a museum could be, and how many other museums have sought to emulate that standard. She understood, as Clement said earlier on in the program, before it was widely recognized, that memory and history are not static artifacts of the past, but powerful contemporary lessons, acts of resilience, acts of resistance, which are now more important than ever before. Irene understood the importance of the lessons of history and how relevant they are and how urgent they are in contemporary America. And we see that playing now. She also understood how important it was for a community to find its own voice and weave together its own stories, its own experiences, and its own histories to create a lasting legacy. And that, in many respects, is exactly what Janum is. So we're deeply honored to have all of you here. We're honored to have Irene's beloved family, Jennifer, Linda, and Stephen, as well as all of you, the dear friends, family, the colleagues, people who've been touched by her work and by her spirit. And before I go on to talk about our guests that we'll hear a little bit later, there are two people that I really do want to acknowledge. I want to acknowledge Rick West, who is on the Advisory Council. Rick, where are you? There. Rick was the president and CEO of the Autry Museum, and I know that he and Irene and Secretary Bunch were certainly in Los Angeles when I was outside of the museum world. We all knew them. We knew the three of them, and we knew that they were this extraordinary force of nature and how they really changed the shape and the trajectory and the direction of museums. And I also want to give a shout out to another of my colleagues, Devin Akman, he's also on the Advisory Council. He's currently the president and CEO of the Michigan University Museum, but he was also the president and CEO of the Arab American National Museum, which was formed on the blueprint of Janum. And Irene was such an extraordinarily powerful partner for that museum, and particularly in the rebuilding of Detroit. So Rick and Devin, thank you so much for your legacy, and thank you so much for being with us tonight. So, now, and I know that David will come up and do a much, much better job than I will, but I can't resist saying how unbelievably delighted I am and the privilege that we all have to be joined by two extraordinary individuals, leaders whose careers embody the very principles that Irene championed: visionary leadership, collaboration, inclusivity, and a deep commitment to telling the full and complex story of our shared histories. It's hard to imagine two more fitting speakers to inaugurate this lecture series than Secretary Lonnie Bunch and Deputy Undersecretary Lisa Sasaki. Yes. Both of them were not only Irene's colleagues, but they were dear friends who walked that journey with her. Secretary Bunch, certainly Irene's co-conspirator in shaping the landscape of museums and many, many other things. And Lisa, who was once Vice President of Programs at Janum, but certainly a poster child for Irene's early recognition and investment in the potential of a strong future leader. That was one of Irene's hallmarks. Both Secretary Bunch and Lisa shared a personal connection with Irene, one that spanned decades and shaped the work that we celebrate tonight. Their discussion will undoubtedly reflect the depth of their experiences, the legacy of their friendship, and the lessons that continue to guide us all. So tonight, we celebrate Irene's legacy as a living, breathing force, as a force of nature that will continue to inspire us and to shape our future. Thank you so much.
And that's fantastic. We're incredibly grateful for your leadership and admire your continued stewardship of the museum and the Democracy Center, both important and meaningful accomplishments for Irene. You're a true freedom fighter. We never talk about you enough. Thank you for all you've done. Another gentleman in the audience, George Takei, I just want to, since we're in the Democracy Center, one of the greatest interviews I've ever done was with George, and he talked about a lot of different things. But he talked about, besides saying the Pledge of Allegiance while you're sitting in an incarceration camp as a Japanese American and a child, while the flag waves outside behind barbed wire, you would talk about your father and how it was developmental to your understanding what democracy is. And how your father always said, democracy takes work. If you want to be lazy as a citizen, then live in a totalitarian government. Let them tell you what to think. But in democracy, you have to do the work. You have to do the research. You have to vote. You have to converse. You have to negotiate. Democracy takes work for every citizen. So we keep that in mind as we sit here in the Democracy Center and truly try to preserve democracy in this country and keep its importance. And I always remember those lines, those words from George. And thank you very much. And thank you for speaking earlier at the reception about Irene Hirano Inouye. We received notice that Mayor Karen Bass had to be pulled away and is unable to attend tonight. But we are pleased to introduce Mr. David Wen. He's the central representative of the Office of Mayor Bass. Please welcome David.
Thank you for having me. I am so honored to be in the presence of freedom fighters preserving democracy. Before we begin, I want to invite Jennifer Hirano, Irene Hirano Inouye's daughter, up here, and Ann Burrows, President and CEO of JANM. I have a certificate of recognition presented to Daniel K. Inouye, National Center for the Preservation of Democracy, on hosting its inaugural Irene Hirano Inouye Distinguished Lecture Series at the Japanese American National Museum, honoring the legacy of Irene Hirano Inouye and her leadership and contributions to empowering the community, uplifting women, and building bridges between the U.S. and Japan. The Irene Hirano Inouye Distinguished Lecture Series furthers the Democracy Center mission to examine issues of race, identity, and social justice in order to transform the attitudes, celebrate cultures, and promote civic engagement. The inaugural lecture features Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, Lonnie G. Bunch III, in conversation with Deputy Undersecretary for Special Projects, Lisa Sasaki, and serves as a fitting beginning for this important discourse. As Mayor of Los Angeles and on behalf of its residents, I extend sincere gratitude for the Democracy Center's dedication to securing democracy by exploring the issues that seek to divide us, as well as the shared values and beliefs that will unite us all.
David Nguyen, thank you so much, and thanks to Mayor Bass and your office for your commitment to Irene's values, her legacy, and civic service. Jennifer, you still with us? She's around. Oh, there you are. Okay, good. I didn't want you to run away. So next, I'd like to welcome to the stage the co-chair of tonight's distinguished lecture series. She is Janum Governor. More importantly, she is Irene's daughter. Please welcome Jennifer Hirano to the stage.
Thank you so much. I am so honored and so grateful to be here tonight with so many of my mom's friends and colleagues, and in most cases, a combination of both. There are a lot of people that have thoughtfully helped to make this an incredibly special evening, and I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to everyone at the Japanese American National Museum, especially Ann Burroughs, Jim Herr, Bill Fujioka, the Board of Trustees, and the Board of Governors for their support. To David Ono, our advisory council, all of this evening's participants who shared really moving and wonderful memories of my mom at the reception earlier, and our very good friends at Nakatomi PR for bringing this wonderful lecture to life. Secretary Bunch, it is truly an honor to have you here as our inaugural speaker. Lisa, it is really an incredible, I think, testament to your relationship with my mom that both of you are here. She was so proud of her affiliation with the Smithsonian and the work that you all did together to exemplify the importance of diversity in our museums. I'd like to thank Mayor Bass's office for their support and for their incredible recognition. Amidst this very challenging and changing national landscape, I have personally found myself thinking of my mom more than ever. Almost like a guiding light, she could turn a difficult situation into an opportunity for collaboration. And by honoring her work today, I think we commit ourselves to following in the footsteps of her leadership that was rooted in looking forward, embracing new voices, and the belief that we're at our best when we're helping each other succeed. She was never one to dictate her beliefs and instead led by example. So just by watching her, I learned growing up that you didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room in order to be the most persuasive or the most respected. And looking back on a career where she was often the only woman in the room or the only person of color or both, it's so clear to me that she was determined to pave a future that looked different for me, my peers, and our children when we took our seat at the table. She would be so proud of Janum's steadfast commitment to democracy, and that this building that we sit in now, which now holds her beloved husband's name, will stand as a place for future leaders to have important and sometimes difficult conversations during a time when we need to nurture a next generation that is compassionate, open-minded, and as committed to their community as she was. At the core of her values was her commitment to her family. I'm grateful to be here with my aunts and uncles, Linda, Mike, Steve, and Marla. Her siblings, Linda and Stephen, having grown up with her just a few miles away from here in Gardena with their mother and father, Jean and Michael Yasutake, can best attest to the fact that my mother was a born leader. She loved her parents very much. Her father was a very proud member of the military intelligence service. Her mother, born in Tokyo, had just, I think, a really important influence on her life growing up. I was lucky to grow up with a mom who, despite everything else that she was doing, always made time for family dinners, Dodger games, USC football, helping me with my homework, and beating us mercilessly on poker nights. Next month marks 5 years since her passing. She was never personally concerned with the idea of her legacy, but through her work, she's planted so many seeds that have only continued to blossom and thrive despite today's challenges to the ideals that were so important to her. Thank you so much again for joining us here this evening.
She is really extraordinary.
A one-of-a-kind type of person.
Tireless, and she is fearless.
Instilled with an ethic of perseverance.
My father was a businessman and an entrepreneur, just never gave up.
Irene Yasutake displayed a strong sense of social responsibility that began as early as junior high.
Why don't we do a fundraiser and raise money to get a wheelchair for the children's orphanage.
And continued through college.
I actually worked at a center on campus called the Center for Social Action. It was during the Vietnam War and Civil Rights era. So a lot of those early pieces formed a lot of what my interest was.
After graduating with a master's in public administration, she went on to head one of the few women's clinics serving the African American community in South LA.
Specific advocates around health, around empowerment, political empowerment formed as a result of that.
There were people wanting to start a museum, and given my experience in the nonprofit sector, would I consider coming and being the executive director? And I said no, I'm very happy doing the work that I have been involved in. And the more they talked about it, I thought, well, maybe this is a good time to think about a new challenge.
Irene saw the new museum as an opportunity to honor her own family history. Her grandfather had lost everything when his family was interned at Rower, Arkansas. Her father served in the MIS.
She looked awfully young, but when she started to talk, she was informed, she was articulate, in command, and very persuasive.
Who really put the national in the Japanese American National Museum.
She was really the captain in the sense of, if we were a ship, she was always looking out into the distance of where we should go.
Initially, I would have thought, oh, this lady's crazy, but I've always been astonished at how she's been able to realize all of these ideas that she had.
She was probably the one who thought, okay, we're going to open the museum and it's going to go into the former Buddhist temple. But at some point, we're going to build another building.
She worked day and night. And when we used to have volunteer parties, she would be right in there cleaning up the floors, moving desks. I mean, she wouldn't leave until everything was done.
In 2008, after leading the museum for 20 years, elevating it into a world-class institution, Irene decided to begin a new chapter with Senator Daniel Inouye.
So I tell people that when we got married, you then have an extended family. When we got married, I married a whole state. So it was, I was kind of amazing.
Irene being Irene, she embarked on a new challenge, helping create the U.S.-Japan Council to forge strong international people-to-people relationships.
One of the signature programs that got created was the Japanese American Leadership Delegation to identify 10 to 15 people per year to go on an extraordinary trip of diplomacy, business, and cultural and social relationships.
The mayor said to me, listen, Mr. Ambassador, there's one thing that you can do. You can provide hope. That's where Irene is incredible. It was the smartest decision we ever made to ask her to consider being our co-founder of the Tomodachi Initiative.
Last I remember, it raised well over $50 million from both the corporate community in the United States and in Japan.
She never leads by fiat or by sharp judgment or with sharp elbows. She is there to provide ideas, provide perspective.
I wouldn't be president of the Ford Foundation without Irene's support, and I wouldn't be the leader that I am without her counsel, her wisdom.
The vision of having a museum like this had not come to be, then you wonder, there would be a huge void. And I think that the people that invested in the institution should be proud that we have a place that helps to allow other people to tell their stories, to do the kind of programming that brings those stories to life and brings the relevance of why it's meaningful now.
was great. I've never seen that video before. It's wonderful. A great way to remember Irene, and thank you for that wonderful video. And thank you, Jennifer, for your words earlier, for all you do to continue the legacy of your mother and all that you do and sharing her life with all of us. So now it is my great pleasure to get tonight's event underway. Our guest speaker is Lonnie G. Bunch III, the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. Tonight, Secretary Bunch will be in conversation with Lisa Sasaki, Deputy Undersecretary of Special Projects at the Smithsonian Institution. And as Secretary, Lonnie Bunch III oversees 21 museums, 21 libraries, the National Zoo, numerous research centers, and several education units and centers. He has held various positions at the Smithsonian Institution, including the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. He also served as a curator of history for the California African American Museum here in Los Angeles. Lisa Sasaki is a Deputy Undersecretary for Special Projects at the Smithsonian Institution, where she provides leadership for the institution in America's semi-quincentennial celebration and efforts that maximize the institution's impact online and in communities across the country. Previously, Lisa also served as the Director of Program Development here at JANM from 2003 to 2012, where she directed major institutional projects. Both Secretary Bunch and Lisa had a personal connection with Irene during her tenure at JANM, which continued through the years. So let's get things started. Please join me in welcoming these two extraordinary leaders.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you so much to the Japanese American National Museum for inviting me here, and also the Secretary. I can't tell you how honored I was to be asked to be in conversation with Secretary Bunch for the inaugural Irene Hirano Inouye Distinguished Lecture Series. Today we're going to be covering multiple themes, including personal reflections and learnings from Secretary Bunch and Irene's early years in their careers, partnerships, and contributions here in Los Angeles, in particular at JANM, as well as the California African American Museum. We're going to get unique insights into the state of the museum field and the future of culturally specific museums. We're going to be touching on the Smithsonian, as well as our plans for the upcoming semi-quincentennial celebrations in 2026. I've had a lot more practice saying that. That is one of my special projects at the Smithsonian right now. And we're really going to be sort of delving deeply into some things up here this evening. But one of the things I noticed in all of the talks that we have is we don't often recognize the powerful presence that Irene had in Washington, D.C. and at the Smithsonian Institution. So I just did want to acknowledge that Irene served as an advisory board member at the National Museum of American History for a number of years. She also served as the board member as well as board chair for the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. And I had the great privilege of being hired by Irene for the second time as the director for the Asian Pacific American Center. And it was my great privilege to work for her in that capacity for a number of years. And in fact, I know Anne had mentioned how much Irene had, allowed you to grow underneath her guidance. And I will say that I am here today because of that guidance, whether that was over late night glasses of white wine, when I had to come to her and say, I don't know how to do something, or when she so gracefully introduced me to the very complicated world that is Washington, D.C., when I was coming from a West Coast perspective and hadn't done a Hill visit, hadn't had the opportunity to know how legislation was introduced, and all of those amazing lessons that Irene gave me. And it was so amazing as somebody who used to sit across from her at meetings or in staff talent shows or sashimi lunches, where I just stood in awe of her leadership here at JANM, to be able to see her in that light. So it's just a wonderful moment for me to be here. So thank you so much. But that leads me to my first question as we go into conversation. If I may call you Lonnie for the purpose of this conversation. Lonnie and I have actually known each other for quite a few years prior to him becoming secretary. But could you tell me a little bit about your recollections of when you first met Irene?
Well, first of all, watching that video taught me something. I thought I was the only person of color that had to learn how to play the accordion. And not only did that change my sense of who I thought I was, she was also playing When the Saints Come Marching In, which was the fight song for my high school football team. Tells you how bad we were. But, you know, I met Irene in 1988. I was a young curator at the California African American Museum, and Irene was embarking on what has led to be an amazing journey. And we talked a lot about the role of culturally specific museums. How could this museum, how could the California African American Museum be transformative? What I think struck me more than anything else was I was trying to just survive day to day. Irene already had a vision. She had a strong sense of what this place could be, but more importantly, what museums could be. And I think for me, that notion of, years later I was in Chicago and I learned the motto of Chicago, which really to me is what Irene was talking to me about all those years ago. The motto of Chicago is make no little plans. And that was Irene. But there are many people who make big plans, but only few know how to implement them. And I think Irene had that ability to straddle many worlds, to understand a vision, but to figure out how to implement that vision. For me, Irene was always somebody who generally made me better, who generally shared, even when I made mistakes, she was kind, except one time. I was working in the 90s in Japan for the Smithsonian. So one of the trips, Irene and I decided we were going to have dinner together in Tokyo. And Irene said, you pick the place. Well, I had this amazingly bad dive in mind. It was a yakitori parlor called Snack Pussycat Club. I thought it was great. So you could see Irene's face when we turned the corner. And there we were. And she said, you're kidding, right? And I said, yes, I'm kidding. So we found a fancier restaurant. But in essence, to me, as I look at Irene's impact, whether it is at the Smithsonian, whether it is through many of the foundations she worked on, what she did, she and people like Rick West made all of us believe that museums could be more than things that looked to yesterday, that they could be places that are essential to today and tomorrow, and that in essence, what good museums are really tools or weapons to fight for democracy, weapons to make a country better, weapons to make people understand that it's important to give people not just what they want, but what they need to know. And that's what Irene taught me.
Thank you so much for that. So we know Irene as being a tireless advocate for women, for diversity, for community empowerment, and U.S.-Japan relations. And you mentioned many of the lessons that she imparted to you. But tell us a little bit more about what made Irene so extraordinary as a leader in particular. Who was she as a leader, and why was she so effective in her leadership?
I think the most important thing for me is that Irene never ruled by papal fiat. She always made sure that in a quiet way, and I know people talk about a quiet way, but I have never seen Irene in a meeting where she spoke more than anybody else. And that in essence, what was so strong about her leadership was it was the kind of leadership that listened, that adapted, that was made better by working with other people. But she was always sort of a collaborator, and I think that was really key. The other thing that was important was that Irene was not apologetic about being a person of color in a predominantly white world of museums. There was not a sense of, oh, I'm insecure, I'm worried. There was a sense that we need to be here, we should be here, and here's our opportunity to change a profession. Because I think that's what Irene did. While she built great institutions, she changed the profession. Very few people get to do that, and that's why I admire her so much.
Well, we know one of the ways that she changed and how JANM has changed the museum field was around this idea of centering a story like the Japanese American experience, especially at a time when mainstream museums weren't doing that. Why is it important for museums to center these stories, and what can be done to ensure that these stories aren't forgotten?
You know, I once received a letter that said, dear left-wing historian. Boy, I see where my mind's right now. It said, what happened to the Smithsonian I loved? It used to tell amazing stories of victory and success. And now you want to tell stories that are better left unsaid. And he went on to say that, don't you understand that America's greatest strength is its ability to forget? He then went on to say that historians like me should be fired, never work at the Smithsonian. It threw me off, though, because he signed a letter, best wishes for your continued success. But the point was that what is essential is recognizing that you cannot run from history, and you really can't even erase history, because it shaped profoundly who we are. And I'm always struck that when Americans say we need to not be brave enough to look at our past, Irene always made clear that the great strength of a nation is looking at its past, learning from that past, and using that past to point us towards a different future. So I think in some ways that notion of using history, finding a usable and useful history. And then what's important, though, which I think Irene did brilliantly, you know, there was a time when all we wanted to do was make sure stories of those left out of history were back in. Let's make sure we say Japanese Americans were here too, African Americans were here too. That was crucially important. But what Irene did was help us understand that while it's nice to make sure those stories are told, the other part of it is to make sure that those stories are seen as stories that profoundly shape us all, not a particular community. So in a way, what Irene taught us is embrace our history, revel in that history, but recognize that that history is stronger, bigger, and more important than one community. It's a history that profoundly shaped the nation. So in essence, what Irene did by focusing on the Japanese American community, she also embraced her Americanist. That's what's something that's so powerful that has shaped and changed the way museums do the work we do.
Yeah, got it. So before being named the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian, you and Irene shared in the Founding Directors Club, both members of that, where you were the founding director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. And when you started, you had one staff member, no collections, no funding, and no site. And it has since welcomed millions of visitors, compiled a collection of more than 40,000 plus objects, and been the topic of a Harvard Business Review case study. You've also written a book about it. Reflecting on your history and Irene's history and successes with culturally specific institutions and the impacts of new museums, we'd really like you to share your insights on the state of museums today in the United States. You've already shared a little bit about that. But what is the role that museums have and the significance of institutions in discussions of race and identity, integrity, and trust?
Well, the one thing I will start out by saying the one thing I loved and learned from Irene is it is really hard to build these museums, but if you persevere, you can get it done. And so she was kind of my model as I was looking at what I was trying to do. I think that what's really interesting is thinking about how does the museum take the country to the greater good? How does the museum be more than a museum, more than an institution? How does it become a force for change, for good, for helping a country grapple with itself? And I think that to me, it was always learning from people like Rick West and Irene that what you've got to do is recognize that these museums matter in profound ways. They matter in part because they're one of the few places where people of different points of view come together. You know, you really get a chance, especially a place like the Smithsonian, you get all kinds of people who would never grapple with a question you've raised until you get into a museum. So there's an educational opportunity these museums have. I think the other piece is that what these museums do is they really force people to engage with each other. I don't know how many times we've been around an artifact and you watch people who don't know each other start to talk about that object. And then they start talking about what it means to them or their family. Then next thing you know, the next group jumps in. And so what you see happening is real learning, real barriers being broken. And I think that's the power of museums. I think that when I look at where museums are today, honestly, I never thought that I'd have to worry about museums being erased from telling important stories. But what's clear is that I was always taught that America was the home of the free and the land of the brave, but we're not brave enough to face our history. We're not brave enough to understand that rather than see these stories as stories that reflect so poorly on America, I think, as Senator Inouye said, what these stories really tell us is that people who are trying to change America are really trying to make real the ideals of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. In many ways, what they're doing is not shaming America, but lifting America to what it can be. The great strength of these institutions are they remind us that America at its best is aspirational. And as such, getting to the promised land takes work. But it takes the opportunity to say, here's how we could be made better by making real those ideals. That to me is the joy of museums, and to make sure that we who work in these museums fight the fight to make sure those stories will never be erased. And it is seriously a fight today.
So in that fight to protect museums as civic spaces, how do we protect museums? How do we protect the staff that are fighting to do this good work?
Well, let's be honest. We're at a point in our nation's history we've never seen this stuff before, right? And so I think that there are several things we try to do. First of all, sometimes museums hide their light under a bushel basket. By that I mean we need to do a better job of talking about what we do, but more importantly, why and how we do it. Because what's the challenge today is people say, well, my idea is the same as your idea, so why do I have to follow your idea? Rather than for us saying, here's how we get to the work we're doing. Here's the role of scholarship. Here's the role of community engagement. So part of it is basically lifting the veil, let the public understand how we get to where we are. But then it's really important to build allies. It is essential that in this political world, you cannot be a good leader of a cultural institution if you're not political. If you don't understand, you've got to build allies. You've got to cross both sides of the aisle. When I built the African American Museum, the first thing I did was find 40 angels, 20 Republicans, 20 Democrats, because you're never going to control Congress. What you want is a tie. You want enough people to say what they're doing is good, and it calms the others down. So for me, in this era, the challenge is, where are those angels on both sides of the aisle? I don't see too many of them now, and that's what worries me. Okay, I guess I can get back to Washington now. They're not going to let me in.
We're counting on you getting back to Washington. So on behalf of the staff of the Smithsonian, one of my jobs is to make sure you get on that plane. Okay. We know how much you'd love to stay here in LA. But going back and talking about the work that you do as secretary, you've launched the Smithsonian's Our Shared Future, looking at race, and in an initiative. The Japanese American National Museum is a Smithsonian affiliate and will host again for the second time the Smithsonian's National Conversation on Race as part of that Our Shared Future initiative. So can you tell us about why this initiative was so important for you? What was the goal? And what have you learned from this nationwide effort to look and to unpack centuries of racism here in our country?
You know, when I became secretary of the Smithsonian, the first thing I had to realize was that I wasn't smart enough to say no. But then I realized that what is the best thing the Smithsonian can do? Now, remember, I took over before COVID. There's George Floyd, there's human remains, there's this whole raft of issues. And I thought, the most important thing the Smithsonian can do is recognize that it has to have a contemporary resonance, that the work we do in science, art, history, culture has to help a nation be made better. And I thought one of the areas that really was a great challenge was having a nation talk about issues of race. I spent a year interviewing people around the world about race. And the one thing 50% said, God, we want to know about it. And 50% said, don't ever raise it again. And so I thought, this is really too important not to. So I decided that we would create a program, Our Shared Future, that would really say, how do we help America look both at its racial history, but also try to point it towards greater understanding? And it was really a somewhat naive, unbelievably optimistic and hopeful, and a belief that said the Smithsonian might be the only place where people will come together and talk about these issues. So we've been doing it now for 4 or 5 years around the country, partnering with people like Janum, and we've learned several things. We've learned that museums are still so trusted that people in places you wouldn't expect will come talk about issues of race. And so the challenge is, now that we know we can have those conversations, how do we then make something concrete out of those conversations? How do we make sure that the conversations play out in an educational arena so that teachers are using those? So I think for me, it is really now sort of putting that layer of education that allows these conversations to be taken into local communities, local classrooms. So I think it's really essential that we do this. Are we criticized? Oh, God, yes. Every time I testify in Congress, they're like, why do you always talk about race? Why are you not talking about race is my answer. But I think that the key here is this is still the challenge to have people feel that they can talk comfortably around these issues. And I think that this initiative isn't going to solve all the problems, but my hope is that other educational and cultural institutions recognize that the Smithsonian gives you cover, and that allows local institutions to help people wrestle with what race, or really what the outsider means in your community. And I think that's the goal, where the outsider is somebody who is disabled, where the outsider is somebody who is a recent immigrant. I think that the goal of this is to get people to recognize that we are made better when we grapple with those differences and bring us together to begin to wrestle with them.
Yeah, and that's actually how we bridge division in our country, is by having those conversations and bringing people together who typically wouldn't.
Exactly.
Yeah. In 2026, there's an important anniversary that's coming up for the United States, our semi-quincentennial.
I can only say 250 if I can.
The 250th.
All right.
And it's a pretty important birthday for the United States. I know I've been working on it.
Yes, you have. You better have.
Yes, that's exactly it. But can you share with everybody here how the Smithsonian will be weaving in the lessons that you just talked about these conversations that bring people together into the celebrations? And what is the role does the Smithsonian play in something like a 250th birthday?
Well, it's interesting. If you think about America and thinking about the 250th, there are really two narratives, right? There is a Trumpian, I shouldn't have said it that way. There's a patriotic narrative that says that America is the great exception. And that all that we've done has really been better than any place else. And any of those issues other people want to talk about are flaws that should be passed over. Then you've got another narrative that says the great strength of America is looking at those moments of challenge, those moments when the country did not live up to its stated ideals. The challenge for the Smithsonian is to create a third narrative, to create a shared narrative that recognizes that there's something powerful about the founding of this nation, about the ideals of the nation. But there's something equally powerful of people who have protested, voted, died, struggled to make those ideals concrete. And if we could find that shared narrative, because I would argue there are many times in our nation's history where we've been unbelievably partisan and divided. This is in the, this is in the top one or two. And I think that it's essential that the Smithsonian try to actually find that shared narrative that brings the country together. But it also means that the Smithsonian has to think about how do you do it in different ways. Unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember the bicentennial. And I remember being in college in Washington, D.C., and coming down to the mall where they had a folklife festival for a month. And they had different cultures coming together. I remember French-Canadian loggers and Navajo code talkers. And what I realized was all of those stories were really about bringing a nation together, recognizing how we're all shaped by those cultures. So part of what I want to do for the 250th is return to that kind of month-long celebration in Washington. But also what I've said is let us find 6 regional festivals that we can partner with around the country. So the Smithsonian is doing that. So let's say you're looking at Chicago to Peoria to St. Louis to Carbondale. I don't want you to do what we're going to do in Washington. I want you to explore what are the cultures that have shaped that region. So I think one, culture is also something that is easier to bring people together around. So we want to do that. And then Lisa's leading us in amazing array of exhibitions and educational programs. Part of the question is, how do you activate the mall and how do you activate the nation? And I think Lisa's really trying to do both of those with her work. My goal here is that we will try to help America find that shared narrative. If we could do that, that's a major accomplishment, and especially in this difficult and partisan time. So that's the goal.
Well, and I'll have to say, one of the things that you said when I took on the task, this particular task.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome. He always gives me the hard ones.
Because she's so good.
You said to me that you didn't want the Smithsonian to shy away from the tension between contemplation and celebration. Mm-hmm. And we have a couple more C's that we have in there around commitment mm-hmm. And commemoration. But that tension point, right, of contemplating our past, but then also celebrating who we are as a nation can be complicated, right? And we're being told that there's only one way to celebrate, which is by ignoring one and sending up a whole bunch of fireworks. So how does that tension work out for you? What does it look like when we examine that?
Well, it looks like I may still have a job in August of 2026. That's how the tension works out. But I mean, I think I would frame it in the way that what I'd love to see, yes, I'd love us to find the shared narrative, but what I'd really like is to be able to help the American public embrace ambiguity. Because we spend so much of our time looking for simple answers to complex questions. We spend so much of our time running away from nuance, subtlety, and debate, reasoned debate. And so I think that if we could, through the work we do, help the public understand it's okay to embrace ambiguity. It's okay not to have all the answers, and it's okay to recognize that debates are part of who we are. But by embracing that ambiguity, suddenly we're saying it's not simply we're a better nation because we build a border wall. It really will tell us we've got to be much more sophisticated and that answers are much more complicated and complex. And I think if we can add a little bit to that through our educational programs that we're doing, then I think we're really doing something that's the greater good. Do I care about the 250th? Absolutely. But I care more about what can happen if we do it right.
Yeah. And part of that charge was really to inspire the next generation of change makers here in the United States to not just see the 250th and 2026 as the end of the journey, but actually the start of it. So on that note, what it would be your message to young people about the importance of museums, of importance of especially when they're coming from different parts, perhaps areas that are far from a metropolitan area like Los Angeles, and who may be considering a career in museums?
A career in museums? You know, I have a daughter who was one of the most gifted writers I've ever seen. And when she was 13, I said, you could be a really good historian, a great curator. And she said, Dad, I want to make some money. So she's an attorney. But I think in many ways what you hope is that you can find, when we were building the African American Museum, we surveyed young kids all over the country. And one of the things that was clear was there was a sense of trying to figure out what's real. They'd grown up on the virtual. They'd grown up, you know, with these sort of games that were not real. And they kept saying, is this stuff real? Is this really the way we can understand our past? So part of what you want is you want to create an opportunity for kids to feel comfortable grappling with complexity, grappling with the real. And then I think what you want to do is you want to challenge them to basically say, it is your responsibility to make a country better. I have always argued that the goal of the African American Museum, which I would never say to Congress, but I'm going to say it now and I'll get fired, but the goal of the African American Museum was to create new generations of activists, of recognizing that there are people who have given so much as youngsters to change a nation. You know, John Lewis and all the people in SNCC, and that what I wanted was people to go through and say, if they can change a nation, so can I. So to me, that would be my hope, is that you create a sense of discomfort and a sense of obligation and a sense of understanding that change just doesn't happen, that you are either part of the struggle or you're the people that we're struggling against.
Yeah. So you mentioned August 2026, and I am definitely wanting you to ensure you're there that time as secretary.
You better call Trump.
But after your extensive career and after finishing off your time as secretary, what do you do next? What does the next chapter look like for Secretary Bunch?
No dealing with Congress, no begging for money. No, realistically, I think, yeah, that is true. I think that what you want is you recognize that you'd love to be able to help museums around the world grapple with these issues that are important. Help museums around the world think about doing exhibitions or think about how do you create new educational structures. So probably when I leave the Smithsonian, I'll be able to say, let's go play. Let's figure out how I can help you do the work you want to do. And then the other thing I'm going to do is be very simply going to New York Yankee baseball games whenever I can.
Yeah.
Nice, simple.
Yeah. Good choice. Good choice on that one. So we have a final question, and I'm just going to start it by saying we're going to think about channeling our friend and colleague Irene and giving words of wisdom for all of us. And I'm going to go first because I've thought a lot about this. Because as I walked into boardrooms when I was younger, oftentimes I would look around and I wouldn't see anybody who looked like me. I wouldn't see women there. I wouldn't see people of color. And I definitely know that I looked to Irene so frequently then as a role model for who I could be as a leader. And one of the things that I took away and words of wisdom that I would give for everybody is to, even during challenging times, you don't have to be the loudest person in the room, because what I thought was so powerful about Irene at a time where people will talk over one another or shout or try to have the most attention paid to them, that whenever she spoke, the room became quiet. And she could always say in her soft voice those words of wisdom that just, as we heard this evening, change our perspectives around things. And so oftentimes I think so much of her power came from listening to the room and then being able to help us all see a path forward. And I hope that for everybody as they find themselves in places of leadership. So what would you send away with to everybody?
Well, I always said to Irene that when I grow up, I want to be Irene Hirano. Because I think in many ways, what you really want is, there are people that have vision, there are people that know how to implement things. One of the things that struck me in any meeting I was with Irene, whether it was about museums or foundations, Irene never got lost. She always knew where she wanted to go. And even if she didn't say it till the end of the meeting, she knew where she wanted to go. So for me, it was this notion of, one, always remember you have to fight the good fight, not somebody else. And two, never lose your commitment to making a place better. Doing what you have to do, but what the doing is really making sure that you don't get lost on the way. By not getting lost, by struggling every day, you're going to change a nation. And there's nothing more noble than honoring all of our ancestors by helping to change a nation for the good.
Yes. So thank you so much, Lonnie, for this conversation today. I will let you know that this is one of the highlights of my time at both JANM and the Smithsonian. Lonnie will know this, but I'll share with all of you. When you shared with me that you were looking to become secretary, I actually got teary-eyed because I was so incredibly proud to be looking at the opportunity to be serving underneath you as Secretary of the Smithsonian, and as somebody who I've known for so long and who I consider to be one of the preeminent leaders within the museum field. So thank you for everything that you do. I know it's a tough job to be secretary. I see it every day, and I just wanted to tell all of you what he does on a day-to-day basis. I don't know how you do it, but I'm so grateful that you do. So thank you so much for sharing this with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
To the esteemed guests, the volunteers, the visitors for joining us tonight, on behalf of the Japanese American National Museum, the Daniel K. Inouye National Center for the Preservation of Democracy, what a great conversation we just had or listened in on, preserving democracy. It was just absolutely wonderful. Thank you, too. We appreciate all of you, and we wish you the best, and good night.